Sir Laurie, and thank you for joining us, Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards, or the Geppetto of the Prime Minister, sitting on his shoulder, giving advice as and when required and requested. Thank you for finding the time, Sir Laurie, to join us this morning. I don't think we need to rehearse with you the importance of standards in public life, nor the necessity of having an effective standards system. Let's just take those as mutual givens. What I think we would be interested to hear is, sir, is your current assessment of the adequacy of the standard system in the UK, both in terms of giving confidence within and throughout government, and crucially in the minds of the public.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to come before you. I think there is a sort of issue of perception and to an extent reality. And the perception is pretty awful. I think we all would agree with that. Public opinion polls and the rest indicate a real decline in trust in people in public life, and particularly those in central government. My sense, and I have now been in this job for just over 3 years, I've met quite a lot of ministers in the previous government and in this government, and I generally have found a real sense of recognition of the importance of the Nolan principles and doing the right thing. And I think the challenge in a world of total 24-hour media scrutiny is that it is so easy to miss something, and that makes it very difficult. And also there's a sort of expectation that people will be completely clean as a whistle in everything they do. And I think that is a challenge. But I actually believe that within those I deal with in the civil service, but also with ministers I've met, and indeed quite a number of members of parliament, and I'm sure you all share this, a real belief in the importance of high standards in public life.
How does one face into that conundrum and not just see a unchangeable inevitability about it?
I don't think I'm an optimist, and I think, and I hope all of us are optimists. I think that there is still more work to be done. You go back to Lord Nolan and his golden thread, where he talked about the importance of codes of conduct, and then the importance of independent scrutiny, and very importantly, the importance of education. And I think one issue is the understanding of the importance of the Nolan principles in particular, and the behaviour that comes from that. Now, I think it is sort of understood, but actually we don't, as a group, talk about the Nolan principles enough and live and breathe them enough. And I think that's important. It is about culture. I've been fortunate enough to work for two prime ministers who do completely appreciate that culture. I think they get it, and that makes my job much more feasible. But I think that's the sort of key is developing that culture. And I think you may go on to ask me about the Ethics and Integrity Commission, and I think that's good news because it raises the profile of the importance of standards in public life.
I'm not going to ask you to comment on any specific cases that you have adjudicated on. I think that would be invidious. But is there an understanding in your mind, and arguably in the Prime Minister's mind as well, that to use a sort of everyday phrase, ministers marking their own homework, has gone, and a way of restoring confidence is that there's somebody who is understanding of the process but separate from it, who adjudicates and imposes a decision rather than merely advising somebody what they might or might not do, but it is only advice which is non-binding.
Well, the way it works with ministers, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the responsibility ultimately for disclosing, conflicts of interest or whatever connections which may have an influence on their work lies absolutely fair and square with the minister concerned. Where the issue arises where I might get involved, and I have regular dialogue with ministers about their disclosures of interest, which they're required to discuss with their departments and share with me. There are some occasions where ministers will ask me for advice, and then there will be occasions where I actually say, look, I need to understand the background here. Can we have a meeting and talk about it? And I think it's important to have a meeting. I will provide advice, and I will generally expect ministers to follow that advice. Ultimately, the decision is up to them. If I am concerned about it, because I think it raises an issue in terms of potential conflicts, then I will escalate that, if necessary, ultimately to the Prime Minister, because I have to.
What happens then?
Well, then, we're talking sort of somewhat hypothetically, and I obviously can't talk about any case, but I would fully expect what happens then is that I am supported in the line that I've taken, and it's important that because when I produce my list of relevant ministers' interests, I say that I am satisfied that conflicts or potential conflicts have all been addressed and mitigations or whatever have been put in place. So I need to be able to say that, and if I can't say it, that's then that's a message to raise.
And that system works on the enduring good chaps, doesn't it? I think and I'm a pessimistic optimist, is as desirable as that might be, is it sustainable in the mid to late 2020s going forward against that rising tide of cynicism and mistrust in the public mind? There are people who are serving time in prison today who didn't agree with what the judge decided. But the judge came to a judgment, issued the sentence, and that's that. They didn't have a discretion as to whether or not to abide by what the judge and the jury, whilst we've still got them, determined. It's now time, isn't it, before we reach breaking point, for that step change.
When you say step change, you're talking about trying to move to some form of statutory underpinning? Or
it's either statutory underpinning or the decision or the judgment which the holder of your office has arrived at is binding and not advisory.
Well, just to, first of all, my office has been in existence for 20 years.
Yes.
And during that time, the sort of powers, if one call it that my office have significantly increased. So, we have a quarterly list of publication of ministers' interests. But I think the most important part of it is the ability to investigate allegations of wrongdoing without requiring the consent of the Prime Minister. And where I do conduct an investigation, whether with the request of the Prime Minister or indeed as a result of a self-referral by a minister or at my own behest, my investigation is published. The result is published in the form of a letter to the Prime Minister. Now, I think that is a very powerful deterrent, and I'm very confident sitting here that is something that I can have made work and can make work.
Yeah, but there's always a but, and then I'll bring in others. And it is that peculiar constitutional thing that the Prime Minister of the day appoints his or her ministers and dismisses them.
Yes.
And that's perfectly proper because they have the duty given them by the sovereign to form a government. But a lot depends, does it not, on the robustness of the Prime Minister, presumption that the Prime Minister of the day knows the difference between right and wrong and understands the importance of rectitude. And 20 years ago, we might be laughing to think that we might be in a situation in this country where we might have a Prime Minister who didn't, but stranger things have happened. It relies fundamentally on the Prime Minister being able to be a good butcher, to be ahead of the public curve and say, my advisor has found this, their advice to me, or they are telling me I have no alternative other than to relieve you of the burdens of ministerial office. Not, I've had this piece of advice, it's going to destabilise the government because it's somebody from the right or the centre or the left, and it alters the tilt and the balance of the coalition of all parties, etc. I'm not feeling strong enough to dismiss them. I'm just going to have to wait for the storm of public opinion to deliver the inevitable coup de grace. And that's fine from the political point of view, but the enduring damage it does to the confidence of the public in the institutions remains as an ever-suppurating wound, doesn't it? And can we, given what you heard, because you kindly came in for the earlier session, given what you heard Lady Stewart say, and what we all recognise and what I think you've intimated as well, we haven't got the luxury of that headroom, have we?
Well, I think the question is, my office has been, I think, well established, well recognised, and where I have got involved in investigations, there's been a considerable amount of attention given to that, and the Prime Minister's support for the advice that I've given him. I mean, clearly it is possible that a Prime Minister might choose to disagree with the advice of the independent advisor, and indeed that happened.
Might have a Prime Minister who doesn't think they need a ministerial advisor, an independent advisor.
That's. But then, you have to look at. I mean, ultimately, you and this committee and Parliament have the ability to hold the Prime Minister to account in that situation, and I think that's sort of, yes, you have the good chaps. I'm a good chap if you call me that, but I think there is a degree of sort of moral authority that I carry at present, and indeed, if there was not to be an independent advisor, Prime Minister saying, I don't need this, I don't need an ethics advisor or whatever, that would be something for Parliament and more broadly for a question about public trust in the system.
Yes, okay. Now, I saw a number of hands. I think I saw Mr. Lamb. I think I saw Mr. Quigley as well.
Exploring this theme, we have already had Prime Ministers who have dismissed advice that they've been given around this and dismissed advisors. Would you believe that a Prime Minister of a Trump model would in any way concern themselves with any letter or advice that you provided them?
I have not met Mr. Trump, and I think that's a theoretical question.
You're aware of his modus operandi.
I'm aware of his modus operandi. I mean, I think for that type of modus operandi to actually take hold in this country, it would require an election.
Yes.
And therefore it would have to have democratic authority, which would therefore remove my role.
I suppose the question that this committee is delving into with a number of different regulators and advisors is whether or not there's sufficient constitutional safeguards against someone who potentially was elected to office, and whether or not we believe that the Constitution stands above whatever the government of the day happens to be. The good chap's theory is not simply about whether or not someone would have followed the advice in the immediate term. It occurs to me it's more that there's a wider cultural shift in our society where people no longer hold these things as being significant, or where sufficient numbers do not believe they're sufficiently upheld currently that it matters what someone does. And if you have a Prime Minister who comes in who doesn't acknowledge what is right or wrong or cares, has a party of people elected, say, for a company that they solely own and which have been appointed solely to support them in that role, and with an electorate that is sceptical about conventional news media and thinks everyone's at it anyway, that idea that there is a safeguard because there is a consequence to that decision no longer exists.
Well, I hear you. I mean, I think the issue, Mr. Lamb, I'm not a constitutional expert. I mean, in this country, we, of course, have a fairly unwritten constitution as such. And what you're, I think, suggesting is that there should be some form of written constitution. That's way above my pay grade, to be quite honest.
Or whether or not there are parts of our existing framework which require greater embedding than is currently the case.
Yeah. Well, what I would say to you, and again, I think this does go somewhat above my pay grade. I can make this role work at present, and I hope I've demonstrated that I can make it work. And I believe I have a relationship with the Prime Minister, as I did with the previous Prime Minister, of being able absolutely to speak truth unto power and have an open conversation. And I fully I believe that the incumbent Prime Minister will respond to my advice. Now, what happens in the future? I mean, that's it's difficult for me to give you a view on that.
I think that's a fair comment.
Thank you.
Mr.
Very brief, because I know Marcus would like to get in. You say the Prime Minister gets it, the previous Prime Minister got it rather, ministers get it, and it's all very encouraging, and your office has existed for 20 years, but the gap between what governments think we're doing and public perception gets wider and worse. Now, I don't expect you to give me a full answer and solve that problem, but, the Nolan principles are very, very clear. Yet we still end up in the position we find ourselves in. Is the issue that, despite them being very, very clear, they're very difficult to measure against? So, we don't have a scorecard that tells the general public at the end of every year how we performed against them. It's not until we breach them it's a problem. Do you get what I mean? Everything seems very clear, but nothing's getting any better.
Yeah, I mean, Lord Nolan, I believe, said that the important thing about the principles is that they are principles and not rules. And therefore, somebody in my position needs to make a judgment because they are principles, and you can only assess compliance, as it were, by making a judgment as to whether a minister has complied with them. And I think that's, I come back to what I was saying about education. I think we possibly don't talk enough about the Nolan principles, and that's one thing which I think with the formation of the EIC will be very much a focus for them for the future.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Marcus Gamazovas.
Thank you, Chair. As you've just touched upon the creation of the EIC and its replacing of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, What are your view on this change? What's your view on this change? And also, I believe you used to attend the former informal meetings that were arranged by the chair of the CSPL. Perhaps you could touch upon, the comparisons. Are we losing anything from the informal nature of the old arrangement, and are there any risks to the new formal arrangement?
Well, of course, it's early days for the EIC. I mean, it's only been going since effectively announcement in July. So it's, and I think you're seeing Doug Chalmers at some point in the future, who will, I'm sure, give you a better view. My perspective is that it's a good thing. I think it's excellent that there is going to be a letter to the Prime Minister annually where the Chair will set out the health of the standards landscape. I think it's good that it is raising the profile of the importance of standards and the importance of codes of conduct and extending those to arm's length bodies. And the network, as they call it, the network of standards bodies which meet. I think we had a meeting last week under the auspices of the EIC. I don't think there's been a huge change in that. The important thing is for the group of us are able to sit around the table and share issues of concern, not obviously casework or anything like that, but issues of concern. And I think I think it may have been Baroness Deach, talked about the benefit of therapy coming from those meetings, and I think that is certainly the case. I mean, there were one or two members who have talked about the concerns. For instance, the Electoral Commission talking about the concerns about the wave of intimidation across the country around elections, and I think it's important that we all we share that. So I think it's very positive.
The network as it stands, are the right people in that network? Is there scope for bringing other people to the table?
I think that's very much a question for the chair. Baroness Deach, I think, mentioned the Judicial Appointments Commission, and I think the Honours Committee. I can't remember, but I think it's always useful those who are involved in some form in appointments or regulating standards or whatever are able to be present around the table, because it's good to share experiences.
Beyond the network, what do you envisage your office, what relationship do you envisage your office having with the EIC, and what role do you think it should play in monitoring the conduct of current and former ministers? I don't think it has, as your chairman said. I mean, my role is to report to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister is the author and owner of the Ministerial Code. The EIC, I think, will take an interest, and actually does take an interest, and raise questions such as would concern this committee. But I think it's more about the general sort of processes rather than specific case matters. What would success and failure for the EIC look like further down the line? In its 5
years.
What do you think it?
Well, I think. I mean, I come back to talking about the golden thread and education. I think the first thing would be, and I referred to this in my annual report. I actually said it's relevant to ministers, but I think it's relevant across the board. Is better induction and mentoring of people coming into public life, whether that's, and particularly for ministers, because it is a massive change suddenly to find yourself as a minister with all the responsibilities, surrounded by civil servants and a diary which is almost impossible to manage. So I think that's one thing I'd want to see as being understood and encouraged. I think more of the Nolan principles, the culture of the Nolan principles. And I'd also feel that success would include a degree drawing from the Nolan principles of less acrimony in public debate and more courtesy, frankly. Because I think public trust, all the opinion polls suggest, the lack of courtesy in public debate is something that really causes a negative feeling. So to be able to, in 5 years or 10 years, to have better mentored sort of ministers and people coming into public life, as I say, better understanding of the Nolan principles, more courtesy, I think that hopefully would then move the dial in increasing levels of public trust in those in public service.
What kind of public profile do you think it would have? Do you see it as something that the public would be far more aware of and conscious of communications from than other existing bodies
of the
within the
EIC? You're saying of the EIC. Now, I see this as general. I mean, the success of the EIC, but of the success of what we're all trying to do, which is to move that dial of public trust in a more positive direction.
Does it have a more direct role? Could it have a more direct role in communicating with the public and widening that gap between what I think someone has described as...
I think the annual letter to the Prime Minister is an important document which will address the health of the standards landscape, and I would hope that gets publicity and is given proper attention across Whitehall.
Laurie Edwards.
Thank you, Chairman. This government's made a number of changes to your role, including the slightly Monty Python-esque changing of your title from the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interests to the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards. What has this meant in practice in terms of how you do your job?
I think the actual change in title hasn't actually made a huge difference, just because I think actually the title better reflects my sort of role. Now, I think people didn't really understand what independent advisor on ministers' interests really meant, and so on ministerial standards it's much clearer. But there have been the changes I referred to, particularly of the quarterly publication of the lists of ministers' interests, the ability to conduct investigations without requiring the Prime Minister's consent, and of course more recently taking on the responsibility for advising on the business appointment rules so far as ex-ministers are concerned.
Thank you. In a letter to the committee, I think in response to our ministerial statement inquiry, you told us that you consider your role as focusing on the conduct of ministers as individuals and not on the actions, policies and collective decisions of the government. How do you make that differentiation? And I guess playing devil's advocate a little bit, are you acting as an advisor on ministerial standards if you're not advising on their adherence to the ministerial code and the actions that they take as minister?
Well, I'm advising obviously on the ministerial code, and I mean, you committee very helpfully, I think, has produced a report on a particular issue which you wrote to me about, and I wrote back, which is the whole question of the rule 9.1 in the ministerial code, or the principle about statements to Parliament, and I would hope that the government will respond to your recommendations in due course, because as I said in my letter, my job is to look at the individual behaviour of ministers. I can't cannot hold the whole government to account for collective decisions, which obviously the most important statements to Parliament will be collective decisions of the government. But I think that I hope that distinction is clear.
So you're commenting on the individual behaviours and decisions of ministers as they relate to the Ministerial Code and nothing more broader in terms of the way the government conducts itself?
Yeah.
Thank you. You're also given the power of your own initiation, and have you had any cause to use this power yet?
No.
What fundamental sort of difference to your role does this power make?
Oh, I think it makes a very, very fundamental difference. I mean, it is. It increases my authority. It certainly constitutes, to an extent, a degree of deterrent. If I say that I want to see a minister or raise a query about something, I think that gives me a degree of authority to be taken very seriously. And certainly my experience has been that I am taken seriously, that I receive really good responses from ministers and their private offices.
I mean, previously you had the power to initiate an inquiry subject to the agreement of the PM, and now, as you've said, you have the power to launch regardless of the PM's views, although I think it was normally given. You've talked a bit about the benefits. Are there any risks of you having this new power that need to be managed?
Risks? Well, I suppose the risk is that I, go, sort of off piste to an extent, and I'm very conscious of that. I am independent. I am solo operator. It is really important. I'm sort of recognised, sort of banana skins all over the place, but also that I need to think very carefully about, the steps I'm taking. And in that, I have the benefit of a very good secretariat, some of whom are sitting behind me, who keep me up to the mark, and I encourage that. I want to be challenged because it's really important, as a one person in this office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Chair. So, really, your role in relation to the general public. If somebody believes they have evidence of a breach of the Ministerial Code or business appointment rules, do you think they should be able to raise it directly with your office?
Well, generally, I think where that happens, it comes to my office anyway, because it comes through the press or whatever. Your question maybe about not having a direct website. I obviously take my sort of work for the Prime Minister. I'm available for ministers. I also make a point of answering letters from members of Parliament because I think that's really, really important and the right thing to do. When it comes to letters from members of the public, they do come through. They come through the Cabinet Office, and I do try to answer them. But often the way these things which obviously allegations of breach, tend to build through the media, maybe through members of Parliament, and that's a much more likely way that things come to my attention.
And so would you encourage MPs, other stakeholders, general public at large, to contact your office, or is the route through the Cabinet Office?
Well, MPs do contact my office. I find occasionally that MPs write letters which appear in the press before I actually receive them, but I do encourage that, and because I think that's important, and it's an important part of my role.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the Prime Minister, Sir Laurie, is both the owner and ultimate judge in relation to breaches of the Ministerial Code. Given what we recognise as the challenging political and public landscape, is this still the best way of doing it?
Well, my terms of reference give me the ability to advise the Prime Minister if I believe there has been a breach of the Ministerial Code. And I think that's an important part of my remit.
Yeah. Which is an interesting answer to a question I didn't ask.
Well, I just thought...
the question I asked you is this the best way of doing it?
Well, I think...
You've told us the way that it is done. I'm asking you, is it the best way?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good way of doing it.
It may be a good way,
well,
but is it given the public's cynicism, is it still sustainable?
I think the question is, what is a better system? And I see myself as independent. My appointment will not be renewed. That's part of the terms of the appointment. And it is really important to be able to give sort of independent, advice without fear or favour, and speaking truth under power. I think, does that system work? I mean, ultimately, it is you to make the judgment, and indeed Parliament to make the judgment.
But you can speak truth into power, and that system works when truth is heard by those in power.
Yeah.
And the ability to differentiate between the acceptable and the unacceptable, the right and the wrong, the palatable and the unpalatable, is part of their DNA.
Yeah.
I think there's a growing concern of the political class in its broader sense of the term being slightly ostrich-like in failing to face into the pressing requirement, to better future-proof the systems that we use as guardrails that help shape the delivery of our public life. So you've told us you've told us what the way is, and you have described it as a good way. My question still remains, given what we know and what we fear, is it sustainable? Is the protection of the current system evolving as it has slightly, as Ms. Edwards has referenced? Is it doing the service to the British state and its preservation that actually needs to be done?
I think at present, yes. I think it works, and I'm in this position. I would not be here if I felt I couldn't make it work. I think that's really important. But what you're talking about is the possibility of a change which would involve some form of statutory oversight or something similar. And that, in a way, that is above my pay grade to comment on. What I can tell you is I can make this work. I mean, if you ask me, do I share your fear? My view is that the authority of the ethics regime, as enhanced by the formation of the Ethics and Integrity Commission, as enhanced by the additional powers I have, make overall, and you've had a number of the standards bodies in front of you. I think between us, we constitute a pretty powerful group. Now, of course, we could all be swept aside, but that would be a major sort of upset.
Yeah, it would be, and there would be some who would just go, and we're in the business of causing upset because it's all been too cosy. We must disrupt. It presupposes, of course, that the independent advisor can tell right from wrong, and it's a direct prime ministerial appointment. would a useful handrail be that a future, and I'm not seeking to to apply this retrospectively, but casting forward, do we think that there might be sense in subjecting your successor to a pre-appointment hearing by Parliament?
I think, so in a way, my answer to your question has to be that's above my pay grade.
No. I'm asking for your sincere observation, because I could think, duty says I have to, or public perception says I have to have an independent advisor. I wonder what Al Capone is doing on, this week. Let's call up Al Capone and see if he wants to be my independent ethics advisor, because he's just going to, nod through anything and everything. So there's a presupposition that the Prime Minister knows right from wrong. There's a presupposition that the advisor knows right from wrong. And Parliament has no way of examining that, because there is no pre-appointment hearing. So should there be, in the interests of transparency and Nolan?
First of all, when I appeared before this committee about 2.5 years ago, which was a post-appointment hearing, I did say that I'd actually gone through quite a number of, 3 interviews, and I understood that there was a short list for my appointment. I know that there are quite a number of bodies, including, I think, the Committee on Standards and Public Life, which recommended that the appointment of the independent advisor should be through a full public appointment process. What I would say, and I don't think that it's my remit to give you a view, but the one thing I would absolutely say very strongly is that the relationship between the individual and the Prime Minister is really important. And it is important that the Prime Minister, assuming a commitment, as the current one has, to standards in public life, assuming the Prime Minister is committed to that they are able to appoint somebody in whom they have trust and with whom they can have an open conversation. And it's also important that the person is able to conduct their business in total confidence.
Is it? I go back to this question of contemporary sustainability. Is it not just naive in this day and age to assume?
Contemporary sustainability. In many ways, I think, need to be the judge of that. I am very confident that, as it stands at the moment, this works.
But you must surely be aware that when you publish, or were you to publish, a highly critical letter in relation to a minister's conduct, the public, the court of public opinion, says, gosh, that fellow Magnus, he's just arrived at a decision. He is the arbiter on all of these things. His word is law. He's sort of, Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments sort of stuff and all the rest of it. And then they get slightly perplexed that, in essence, all you can do is advise the Prime Minister of the day to take a decision on the behaviour of somebody who that Prime Minister appointed to do a job. And then they go to themselves, in no other walk of life would that be an acceptable way of dealing with these things.
Well, I push back slightly. Now in
push back as robustly as you.
Yeah, no.
As you
well, in major companies in the world, I come from the corporate world. Investigation of a director, will be normally handled by sort of an independent employee, whether it's compliance officer or whatever. And the chief executive who would have appointed the person being investigated would take the advice, have to take the advice, partly because they might have a regulator overseeing them, but actually because that is the responsibility within a board. And I would see that, I see this as equally applying with a Prime Minister, the Chief Executive, Chairman of a board, receiving independent advice on the behaviour of an individual member of that board, i.e. minister, and taking and acting on that advice. And it's a matter of proper, good governance practice.
What happens when the Prime Minister is reading the advice that you've given about the Prime Minister?
That's has happened in the past. My predecessor conducted an inquiry in relation to the decoration of the flat in Downing Street. It is perfectly feasible, and if it was necessary, and indeed you would have seen there was an exchange of letters between the Prime Minister and myself concerning his involvement in the appointment of the chairman of the football regulator.
Yes.
So it is, and we had a conversation about that, obviously, before leading to that exchange of letters.
It works because the people who work it know how things work and can tell right from wrong.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
That's not a bad thing.
Well, it may not be a bad thing. The question is, in my mind, is it a justifiably and or sustainable thing casting forward? But you're right, Sir Laurie, to point that that's a political decision, not for you to come to. Mr. Lamb.
Thank you very much. You've now taken on the role of administering the business appointment rules for ministers. What is your view of the rules?
I think the rules are, coming from a perspective of somebody working who's worked in the commercial world, I think those business appointment rules are surprisingly restrictive, actually, in the sense that in the commercial world, it would be very difficult to stop somebody from taking a job for 2 years, probably even for 1 year, particularly when you're not paying them. But it's 3.5 months since I've been involved in advising on the business appointment rules for former ministers, supported by a very good team who were previously advising Aqaba. I think that the sense I have is a real readiness on the part of ex-ministers to ask for advice and to follow the advice, and that's a good thing. But I'm leading on to it, but I think what has been good to have achieved is a sort of more efficient management of the advice provided under the business appointment rules, so as to answer inquiries more rapidly than was happening hitherto.
Thank you. I mean, you specify they're very strict, and I suppose to an extent they are, but there have been concerns expressed that the enforcement mechanisms are not currently sufficient, and we can think of one particular example who seems to regularly violate the rules without particular consequence. Do you feel that the changes are needed around this in order to ensure there's better compliance?
Well, of course, the government has introduced changes for the future. I mean, with effect from the middle of October when I took over. So, for breaches, ministers who going forward were to breach the rules, they would be expected to repay their 3 months severance pay for a serious breach. I still think that having now been involved in something like 40 cases, that actually there is a real recognition by ex-ministers of the need to comply with the rules. And I think it's logical that ministers come under the independent advisor in respect to the rules, because we're looking at ministers' interests as ministers, whilst they are ministers. Also, they attest to comply with the Ministerial Code. And of course, Chapter 11 of the Ministerial Code refers to the business appointment rules. And so there's a sort of logical link.
Yeah, I can certainly see the benefit of marrying the two together. I suppose, is it another area where we're reliant upon people being good chaps then, in order to agree to follow the rules, where there may be one or two people who, by virtue of the money they might make doing something else, may well not see the penalties being particularly significant?
You're right. I mean, I would have to say that from my experience, most ex-ministers are good chaps so far as the business appointment rules are concerned. I mean, there will always be one or two people who breach those rules. So there is now, for the future, the sanction of withdrawing the severance payment. Now, I accept if somebody's going off working for some sort of AI, tech company being paid gazillions, obviously repaying their severance pay will be chicken feed. But there are other things, which I think is the shaming of those who breach the rules. And I would have no hesitation in going public if I saw evidence of that. And I think there are other things which one might think about. I mean, whether the sort of honours committee and people like that would take notice of it, just generally to reinforce that this is these rules need to be complied with.
Are there any other changes that you might make to the system, if you were able?
If I was able, I think at the moment I need to have more time. Okay. Frankly.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm playing devil's pessimist to your angelic optimist, Sir Laurie, but shame only applies when one understands it, when you can feel ashamed and be shamed. If you've got a brass neck of whatever, it doesn't matter, does it?
Well, that's that's where the system arises. I mean, shame is an important factor, which I think has considerable weight. I mean, if you're looking at sort of criminal sanction and things like that, I mean that's a different order of magnitude.
Okay, right. I'm going to turn to our final question to Mr. Quigley.
So you 2 years left of your term. What do you think the main challenges will be in that period, and how do you hope to achieve or overcome them?
Well, when I was first appointed, the Cabinet Secretary at the time said the best success would be that we never hear about you, or hear from you, and that hasn't really happened. What I would hope in the final 2 years is that I can help to see the advice provided under the business appointment rules delivered efficiently. I would hope that I wouldn't have to undertake any investigations into ministers which see the sort of public light of day. And the reason for that is I would hope that there would be a real understanding by ministers of the importance of the Ministerial Code and the management of their interests and disclosures and the rest of it. And I would hope to be able to hand over to a successor who has the confidence and support of this committee to carry on.
The renewal in faith in government. Thank you, Chair.
Sounds like a revivalist meeting. Actually, I lulled you inadvertently into a false sense of, gosh, but, I can get out of here. We have one more question for you, Sir Laurie, if you don't mind taking it. Laura.
Thank you, Chair. The interim chair of ACOBA, before it was abolished, told us that she had concerns about the government's transparency reporting. Do you feel that ministers are sufficiently transparent about the meetings with those seeking to influence government policy, or would you make any changes to the level of detail or the timeliness of the reporting?
Well, my responsibility is for ministers' private interests and the management of those in terms of enabling them to do their jobs. The government has, of course, increased the transparency of disclosure of gifts and hospitality, which previously ministers disclosed that every 3 months. They now have to disclose it every month, which is in line with the parliamentary disclosure regime. I'm not involved in the disclosure of meetings, which is a Cabinet Office responsibility. At the moment, I think that is still disclosed every 3 months. But that I don't see that as, that's not part of my remit to take responsibility for that.
Does it not have an impact, though, on whether, when you're checking whether ministers are abiding by the ministerial code and aren't engaging in activity that is conflicted, either actual or perceived?
Well, what I would hope is, is that in looking at the minister's interests, which includes constituency interests and the rest, we will have agreed with their departments and with the relevant minister mitigations if there are potential conflicts. And therefore, I'm look to the private offices and the departments concerned to act as the sort of to monitor that. It will come to my attention at a later stage if there is either a sort of allegation of some impropriety, and partly possibly when those meetings are actually the detail of those meetings are published. But I don't have a sort of a team conducting due diligence on ministers' disclosures of meetings. So it would be reactive, and I rely on the private offices to monitor ministers' activities.
Thank you. No other questions from colleagues, in which case, Sir Laurie, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Order.